slides. Hi. Hello, everybody. This is the IPA Journal Club featuring Donnel Stern. Next slide. I'm Jack Drescher, and I'm the moderator, and you can read my bio. You probably read my bio. Next slide, please. This is, I think, our 9th or 10th journal club. You can actually see all the past journal clubs, both on the IPA website for the journal club, and IPA has a YouTube channel. We will put the link for the YouTube channel in the chat so that you can see that. And the next slide. So our visiting author today is Dr. Donnel B. Stern, a PhD, who's a training and supervising analyst at the William Alanson White Institute in New York City and an adjunct clinical professor of psychology and a clinical consultant at the New York University postdoctoral program in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. He's the founder and editor of a very prominent book series at Routledge called Psychoanalysis in a New Key, which has, I think, probably even more than 90 books at this point, and was the former editor-in-chief of Contemporary Psychoanalysis, which is the journal of the White Institute. He's published psychoanalytic articles and book chapters since he began to write about what he calls unformulated experience in his first article in 1983. He has authored 5 books and co-edited 4 others. His first, hold no, go back. Anyway, he has so many publications, but this is in the ad that we sent out. I think his most recent book, just released, is on coming into possession of oneself, transformations of the interpersonal field. Next slide. So the goal of the Journal Club, for those who've never been here yet, is to be interactive so that you, the readers, can speak directly with an author. And we are recording the session, so it'll be available both on the IPA website and the YouTube channel of the IPA, usually within a week. If you don't want to be recorded, you can turn your camera off. But if you do not wish to be recorded, I might not call on you to ask the question because we'd like this to be face-to-face interactive. Next slide. If you have questions or comments, don't use the chat. You can use the Q&A section. We're not using the chat function, but you can use the hand raise function if you want to be called upon. Next. And when you're called upon, unmute yourself, turn on your camera if it's not already on, and then identify yourself, let us know where you're from, and speak slowly and clear because not everybody who's tuned in is a native English speaker. If you haven't downloaded the paper yet, ideally you should have read it, but if not, we will put the link to do so in the chat as well. Next slide. Okay, so that's our next webinar. We'll come back to this slide later. Okay, great. All right, so I'd like to start. Don, welcome.
Thank you.
So I'll start with how you started your paper by writing, I will argue that the most precious analytic moments usually have to do with feeling understood. And so my question was, when I started reading is what prompted you to take up this argument when you did? And the corollary question is, and who are you arguing with?
Okay, well, let me begin by thanking you. First of all, for the invitation, but also for spending your time and inspiration on getting this program going. I think it's a valuable thing for us to have in the field, these sorts of conversations. And I have the impression that the idea of doing this was yours, and you also are its steward, its leader, its the person who's carrying it out, and it's the steward of the process, which I hope you're able to continue after your tenure, whenever that should end.
Thank you.
And thank you for asking me. And I'm glad to see all the rest of you here. Thank you for coming. Hope we have a chance to exchange some words. So about your first question. Well, this paper was, interpretation is a thorny issue for me, which is a funny thing for an analyst to say, since one might argue that interpretation is understood by most analysts as their primary professional technical preoccupation, perhaps. Not so much for me. I don't actually work with the idea that I know what's in the patient's mind. I prefer not to. And so I would probably not have written a paper on interpretation were it not for the fact that the editor of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, not currently, but the outgoing one, Mitch Wilson, his last issue was December of not this last December, but the one before that. He wanted to do a symposium on the question of interpretation for his last issue. So he asked, I don't know, 4 or 5 of us to write papers that he thought, he imagined that we would each have something to say from our particular part of the field, and he was right in my case. And so that's how I chose to write about or address the topic in the way that I did, but especially at the time that I did. As far as who am I arguing with? Well, it is a bit of a straw man at this point. The idea that interpretation is a problematic concept, because I think everybody's familiar with the idea, whether they agree with it or not. We are, when I was training, it was long enough ago that the idea that therapeutic action had to do with relational effects, events in the analytic relationship itself, was not unfamiliar, but it was very controversial. And I think today, while it certainly is something that people still argue about with regularity, it is not as controversial, and it's certainly more familiar. The idea that such a view can be held. So I wrote a paper about interpretation, which is not exactly about interpretation. It's about thinking about interpretation as the signpost that the important thing has already taken place. So I suppose that, Jack, I would say I'm arguing or taking issue with or wanting to converse with people who feel that the information value of interpretations is what matters, because that's not my view.
Got it. Which my next question was a little bit, and again, anybody wants to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand at any time during this meeting. But could you talk a little bit about how the concept of witnessing came about in your clinical work? Because it made me think about why I think of what I think of as an interpersonal or relational psychoanalytic truism, that there is no self without the other, although I don't remember who coined that term. So what do you think about that?
Well, what I mean by witnessing is the sense that someone else not only has an empathic appreciation of your experience, but that there's a certain degree of a certain affirmation involved. An affirmation that there is something important about the fact that this is your experience, not just because you own it, but because it's something you've created. And the title of the book that this paper appears in, it first appeared in the journal in JAPA, but then it appeared in my most recent book, which just came out a couple months ago. The title of that book is the title of the first chapter in it, On Coming into Possession of Oneself. That phrase is meant to describe what I take to be the impact or the effect of witnessing on the patient. And by that, I mean what takes place in therapeutic action that can be attributed to the witnessing function of the analyst and the willingness of the patient to participate in being witnessed, which is just as important. So witnessing means to be witnessed means to be aware that one's experience is not only washing over you. It's not only coming about as something that comes to your notice. It also means that you are aware in some kind of a new way, quite often, that you are the one who's making that experience. It's not a matter of conscious creation of experience, nothing so intellectualized, but that you are the source and the impetus behind the experience coming to be.
You being the patient, I mean,
Well, I do mean the patient, but it
okay,
works for the analyst too.
I see.
Quite often what happens is that the analyst is not in a position to provide that witnessing function and needs to be able to witness themselves from the inside, from one part of themselves to another, in order to reconnect in the way that makes it possible to offer that to the patient. That's one of the things that this little paper is about. But this paper, incidentally, is a part of a succession of maybe, I don't know, 8 or 10 papers in which this idea is taken up and expanded.
Well, yes, it's complex because like the thought that comes to my mind is like what is the relationship between the notion of witnessing and a co-constructed narrative, for example, within psychoanalysis?
Yeah, it is the notion of a co-constructed narrative is the broader concept under which the idea of witnessing would be ranged, that it would appear there. But to witness has to do with knowing that, not just knowing and feeling, as I think I quoted in this paper from another paper, not just knowing that I am feeling and I'm sorry, let me start that again.
Take your time.
Not just knowing and feeling, but knowing that it's me doing the knowing and feeling. And this often comes about only as a result of being treated in a certain way by the analyst. And that way of being treated is what I refer to as witnessing. It goes beyond the co-construction of a narrative because it has to do with a state of relatedness between two people. The analyst has an affirmative investment in what the patient is experiencing and lends that, so to speak, to the patient in the course of doing the work together in such a way that the patient, the result is that the patient feels more than they did before, that I am the one who is doing the knowing and feeling. I had another thought, but I've lost the tail of that. But I'll pull it out of a corner here as we go along.
So again, since nobody else is speaking up, I'll continue. But I was thinking, so if I were to find, because this is the editor in me always looking for a way to, like find language that I would use, is it a form of knowing that I'm being empathized with? That the fact that I know that I know the analyst seems to be empathically attuned to my states, that helps me feel my states and recognize them as real.
It includes empathy, but it's by no means limited to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's another paper in which this is the primary subject. That's the one that's called on coming into possession of oneself, which came out in the quarterly a couple of years before this one, and is in the same book that I mentioned. But the thing that's different from empathy largely arises from a self-psychological point of view in modern psychoanalysis, it seems to me. And it's about the analyst's empathic participation with the patient. For Kohut was a certain kind of object relationship. But what I'm talking about is not an object relationship, but a subject relationship. That one appreciates where the other is coming from, and the patient appreciates where the analyst is coming from, but not as an object. The analyst is not performing a function, an auxiliary function to the patient, as Kohut would describe it. He's not performing a part of the patient's ego, which the patient eventually is going to take on and become themselves. He is a separate, the analyst that is a separate person with their own subjectivity that the patient can see. That's true of somebody who feels positive about what the patient is saying, and not just understanding, accepting in a way that is more affirmative than empathy would be.
Which is interesting because the next question I had starts with a quote from the paper. So you wrote, "From my perspective, the most important reason that the content and accuracy of the analyst's interpretations matter is that they are contributions to the analyst's growing capacity to serve as the patient's witness. They matter because they mean to the patient that the analyst knows the patient. They matter because they are the evidence most available to patients that they have a home in the analyst's mind. I believe that, as you, Don, believed, as Bromberg puts it, quote, the primary source of therapeutic action is the relationship, not something created through it." That's the quote from the paper, which brought to mind, as your last statement did, the heresy of Franz Alexander's corrective emotional experience, a paper that I got handed in many of my courses when I was a candidate at White. Could you comment on why that concept was so controversial almost a century ago? And in what ways is witnessing synergistic or different from the idea of a corrective emotional experience?
Oh, it's very different.
Okay.
Alexander's corrective emotional experience is a calculated participation on the part of the analyst. The analyst plans to have a certain effect on the patient. That is not at all what witnessing is about. It is not calculated. It's not planned. It's something that happens spontaneously, if it happens at all. What Alexander thought was he had an admirable desire to speed up psychoanalysis in the 40s and 50s. He wanted to make psychoanalysis more available to a larger number of people, which of course is something I think we'd all love to see. And it was at a time when the therapeutic action of psychoanalysis, at least in the United States, was understood ego-psychologically, and that meant that it was interpretation and the information value of interpretation that made the difference. But you had to connect it to the transference. The interpretation that mattered was the interpretation of the transference. So Alexander argued, well, so what we should do is figure out what the transference is, and then quite purposefully act differently than what the transference figure would have acted. Well, I mean, from our current perspective, looking at that, it seems kind of naive, but you have to remember this was how long ago it was. We didn't have a perspectivistic view of these things. Even deciding how to act differently than a transference figure sounds like an order that doesn't make any sense, but the desirability of it doesn't make sense either. I think that one of the things that's always been important to me is that, I have always felt that psychoanalysis a psychoanalyst needs to do two things to be able to be of use to the other person. Everything that they do has to be intended to be analytically useful in some way that they can describe, but it also has to be personally meaningful to the analyst. If the analyst doesn't mean it, if it doesn't come from the analyst's experience of the patient and grow in a way that the patient can grasp from the analyst's involvement with and knowledge of personal knowledge of the patient, then and it doesn't grow spontaneously from those things, then it's not going to have much of an impact. What Alexander was arguing was that the spontaneity could be drained away from it without without there being, a disastrous consequence. I don't think that was right. So it's very different in that respect. And I must say, when I was, in training, I remember Alexander's paper being given to me several times too. Usually, though, it was as with a cautionary note, because I think he used to be, roundly criticized for this view, and I don't think he deserved it. I think he was trying to speed things up in a way that's quite understandable. It's just that it doesn't work. But I certainly sympathize with his desire.
Thank you. That was very clarifying. Anybody in the audience have a question yet? Because I have more, but I'd love to have other people raise a hand, speak up. Anyone?
For whatever it's worth, I really don't think there can be such a thing as a bad question.
Yeah.
Or comment. It doesn't have to be a question.
Sure. Anyone? No. Okay. Well, then I'll go on to mine. I have, Mardashay, go ahead. Please introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from.
Yeah, thank you. Mardashay Sido. I'm a first-year candidate at Columbia.
Hi.
And thank you for such a great work. I echo what Donnel said. Jack, thank you. That's just amazing. And I have a question again. Thank you for making it easy by saying there's no such thing as a bad question. And I did not get to read the paper. I apologize for that. But as I'm curious about, as I understand you're thinking about interpretation, what would you say is today the value of interpretation, especially for me, who is just starting my first year candidate?
Yeah. Well, it is contained at least partially in what the quotation that Jack selected. I think it was, if I say so myself, it's a little self-serving maybe, since it's my thing he's selecting it from, but it was well selected, I think. So what does an interpretation do? I think, and this is true of my work with my patients, it's also true of my precious memories of my own analytic work with my analysts. I think that what matters about an interpretation it's really not true that what matters is its information value. The fact that it says something that's true about the patient. It has to be that way, yes. If it's not right, if you've missed something, then it probably isn't going to be as helpful as if you haven't missed it, as if you've gotten it right. But it's not the information itself that matters. What matters is that the patient knows that you've been listening well enough and deeply enough involved in what's transpiring in that room to be able to say something about them or about you and them, something or other that could not be said before. It doesn't have to be dramatic, maybe just a little different than before, but it's something that is it conveys the depth and effectiveness of your involvement. It means my analyst knows me. My analyst knows what I'm like. Now, most of us would say that interpretations also don't have, I should say all of us would say that interpretations are not meant to be critical. We obviously don't wish our patients to feel bad or ashamed, which is of course very easy to do when we point something out. So in addition, my analyst, what the patient thinks to themselves is something like, my analyst not only knows me, they know my bad parts, but they are able to know my bad parts without feeling about them the way that I feel about them. And all of this depends upon the accuracy of the analyst, the interpretation of what the analyst has to say, but it's because the accuracy conveys the analyst's relationship with the patient, not because of the information value of what's being conveyed. Does that make sense, Mardashay?
A lot, and extremely helpful. Thank you so much for that.
Essentially, my so say, I'm always like editing while I'm listening. So like like it's a little bit, the discussion between one person, two-person psychology. So that interpretation leading to insight is a one-person way of thinking about, what the value of the interpretation is. And what you're talking about is that it's a two-person, that there's an awareness within the patient that there's an understanding and listening other.
Yeah,
Right.
that's right. I
Okay.
would, it actually, Jack, when you say that, it gives me the opportunity to emphasize something I would like to emphasize.
Please.
And that is, look, everything that I've ever written in one way or another grows from the source of my initial interest in unformulated experience. Think of unformulated, and let me just say a few words about what that means. Unformulated experience is a way of understanding unconscious process, not just some unconscious process, but what unconscious process means. And it's different than the point of view that was dominant at the time that I initially wrote the ideas, which was the first paper came out in 1983. So it's been a long time ago. Different than what was most prominent then in psychoanalysis, and probably still is, which is the idea that we contain within us somehow knowledge that is distorted or hidden away, parked in some hidden corner of the mind, fragmented, somehow changed so that we can't know it, and that knowing that information is what makes a difference. Unformulated experience as a model of the unconscious is very different than that. In this way of thinking, unconscious process is potential experience. It's what experience might become. There are many different things that any particular unformulated experience might become. Not anything. It's not just whatever you choose is true. There are constraints on what can validly be claimed to be true on the basis of any particular unformulated experience. But there is a range of meaning within which there's variation possible without being either inaccurate or crazy.
Could you give a clinical example, general, without
Sure.
too many, because I think that would
Yeah,
help
but
to understand it.
it will. But I need to say a couple other things first.
Go right ahead.
And one of those. So the idea is that unconscious process then is not like crates of things stacked in a warehouse that you go discover somewhere. It remains to be created, and it's created in process with other people. Now, what I wanted to do in thinking about unconscious process was to preserve what I found inspiring and majestic about Freud's understanding of unconscious process, but to give a wider, to a more important role to the context within which experience consciousness comes into being, in the context of formulation, if you will. And that context has to do with other people. So I wanted to preserve the idea of the significance of unconscious process in a world in which the presence of other people was given a role too. What I mean by that is, imagine this range of things that any particular unconscious process can become. I will get to an example. Imagine that there's a range of things that could be true. What is it? The question then, the most important clinical question is, what is it that determines which of the meanings in that range comes into view, it comes to fruition in consciousness, the meaning that we end up living? Which one of those things is selected? Well, my answer to that question is that it's the interpersonal field that makes the difference. The nature of the relatedness with the person in whose presence, and this could be internal or external, between two self states or between two real people, the person in whose presence the conscious experience comes into being. The nature of the field, what's allowed by the field that these two people are creating together, determines what's possible for each of them to create as conscious experience. So you have there an idea, and then we end up at this paper, you see, because that's what I'm suggesting is an interpretation. We'll come back to that. I can give you any number of examples of this. I'll give you one that I used in my first book, which was actually something that it was a dream of my own. I told my analyst this dream. It was a dream. At the time, I think I was 30, 32, and I was married very young. I was going through a divorce, and I was having a bad time of it. And in this dream, there was no obvious connection to my current circumstances in my mind, but the dream was deeply moving to me. I was on a twisty mountain road that was rather dangerous and covered with snow and ice, and it was snowing heavily. And I rounded, and I was worried about the drive and about moving along. And as I went around a corner on the road, and suddenly there was light everywhere, and the color returned to the world. It was not dark anymore, and the light shone on the beautiful colors of the blue sky and the green trees and the white snow. And there was a certain kind of wonder that I felt in the face of this. So I told my analyst this, and he said something very simple. He just said, those are the resources that you're going to be able to call upon to make a life for yourself. It moves me even now. It was very true. Now, was that meaning embedded in the dream somehow, in the traditional way that we think about the creation of experience? Is that what the dream meant in some objectivistic way? No, not at all. I mean, all of us can see that. There are any number of things one could have said about such a dream. That certainly, maybe none of us would have thought to say that particular thing. I don't think I would have. But he knew me. And for him to say that at that moment was very meaningful to me. It was right, and it certainly helped me with the content that he was telling me. But it helped even more because I was so moved by the way that he knew me, which was reflected in what he had to say. So this is a dramatic example, but these things happen all the time with our patients. When we say something that matters to them, we're saying something that serves a witnessing function. You can see how he witnessed me in this example. My analyst witnessed me. You can see that I had the experience when he said this, that I was suddenly in touch with a source of hope that I had represented to myself, but without even knowing what it was. That, of course, rounding that corner and the light and so on, there was a source of hope that I didn't even know that I had, although I felt whatever it was felt awfully good. But when he said what he did, I was suddenly able to feel not only that there was hope washing over me, but that I had made it. This was my dream. I was the author of what he said to me. And so the paper refers to, the title of the paper, just to refresh your memory, is Interpretation, Voice of the Field. And the point that I'm trying to make here in this paper is that interpretations are never the creations to the degree that we think they are of an analyst. They are the voice of the field. They grow out of the presence of the two people together and what can become of it. My analyst certainly was responsible for what he said, and it moved me because he was, but he was not only responsible. Without me and what we did together about this idea would never have been available to him either. So this is what I mean by calling interpretation the voice of the field. And it's what I mean when I say that the important thing about an interpretation is not its information value. It is what the fact that my analyst knew this about me, the information value, meant about his relationship to me.
What came to mind as you were speaking is the experience of many people in our field of having had more than one analysis, for example, where, people talk about, the different things they get from their different analyses, which is indicative of how, different relationships bring up different parts of the person, that there is no one, there was a fantasy, I think, in the beginning of the field that, there was, like you had to sort of go through a certain number of steps in your analysis. And, when you get tested as a candidate at the end, like, did you cover all these areas, et cetera. But in fact, what you're saying is that's really not the case. Depending on who the analyst is, you're going to get a very different kind of relationship and a very different kind of analysis.
I have no doubt that's true, as well, but it's also true that there will obviously be important areas of similarity, because there is such a thing as an individual. There is such an idea as character that we bring with us from one situation to another. But the expression of these things in any particular interpersonal context is always going to be the product of what happens between me and the other person.
Right. Again, I have more questions on my list, but I would love to hear from anybody else. Howard, I see your hand. Yes. Howard Kovitz. Introduce yourself and tell us where you are.
I'm Howard Kovitz. I'm an analyst practicing north of Philadelphia the past 50 years or so. I mean, lots of thoughts about this, but a primary is why it took so long in our field to arrive at what seems like a simple look at what it means to have an intersubjective relationship, say in the maternal dyad. I was thinking as you were speaking about interpretation, about a comment that Mahler made in her book on symbiotic psychosis, where she says that she was often surprised that the worst of mothers kind of intellectually understood. They understood what was going on. They even understood what they were doing wrong, but couldn't actually bridge a gap with their child, and the child was left lost in space, however one thinks about Mahler's early work. But we went through 100 years of looking at the informational value of the interpretation as what was salient. Do you have any thoughts about why institutionally we ended up so stuck? Until again, I think that light you saw on your winding road appeared to lots of us in the early 80s. To lots of people, all of a sudden, it was clear that it wasn't the informational value.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. I mean, but it was like a shot of light coming out all of a sudden across the field. And
well, I don't think psychoanalysis started out to be to be what it is to many of us anyhow now, which is a certain kind of to me, psychoanalysis is the way, it's a very particular way that one person can be of again, very special kind of use to another. That's what I think psychoanalysis is. It is not a medical procedure. It is not, it's not analogous to the administration of antibiotics, for example. But its origins lie there. Its origins lie in the attempt to create a psychiatry that grew out of a traditional medical attitude. These days, I don't think many of us are dominated by that anymore. But you had to in the beginning, and for a very long time, I think we were stuck with trying to pigeonhole our work into a biomedical model. And the people who started actually rebelling against this were my own forebears, at least in our country. The people who were rebelling about this were the early interpersonalists, starting in the 20s. They really took issue with a great deal about the most traditional, what became known as the most traditional kind of, psychoanalytic theory. That was, Horney and Thompson and Sullivan and Fromm. And that's those are the deepest, and Ferenczi, of course, those are the deepest roots of what has become today relational psychoanalysis. I think of myself as both interpersonal and relational, and I'm proud to be a descendant of those roots.
Thank you. Oh yes, Susan Budnick, could you unmute yourself and introduce yourself, tell us where you are?
Hi, I'm Susan Budnick, and I'm an analyst who trained in England and is working in Florida and New Jersey. So yes, I just wanted to follow on from what Donnel Stern is saying about his understanding of why it took so long. I also wonder about the transferences and the loyalties to institutions and theoretical ideas. There's a very strong, I mean, I don't think it's just how it's seen as medical versus, an art, psychoanalysis. For instance, understanding trauma and accepting trauma, let's say from Kohut's idea, even Kernberg took a very, very long time. So there is this kind of loyalty to we're the Kleinians, we think this way, and this one thinks this way. And so I think that the rigidity of some of this may be related to that. I'm not saying it's set in stone. It's a troubling thing, so I'm not going to try and oversimplify it.
Well, Susan, if I may use everybody's first name, I will.
Sure.
My response to you would be, bully. I mean, that's there are many reasons, and the thing I said to you, Howard, was just one of them. We certainly could take the point of view that you just described, Susan, and others as well. I think but we did not think of psychoanalysis as a socially embedded endeavor. We thought of it as something that had to do with an individual mind and how you made changes in it. And until you really accept that it's a socially based endeavor, I think that the significance, just for example, of what the significance and interpretation bears in the process of therapeutic change remains invisible.
If I can just follow up, if one thinks of psychoanalysis as the patient for a moment, I mean, what would be an effective interpretation that would carry, that would be hearable inside of the psychoanalytic movement over the past years, or even in the present, for those people?
I'm sorry, Howard. Can you start that sentence again? The last one.
Sentence. I'm sorry.
What would be?
If you think of psychoanalysis as the patient,
yes,
and it's stuck in a certain way of relating and a certain way of functioning. I'm wondering if there's anything we can think of, you can think of that one could say to psychoanalysis that would be hearable and at the same time feel as if it was attending to the needs and moved it forward.
Well, there've been any number of people, and that's not true. There have been a substantial number of people who have actually tried to do what you just described. I mean, the most famous quotations I can think of belong, one, to Harry Stack Sullivan: "We are all much more simply human than otherwise," which means that the analyst and the patient are really playing on a level field. And the other would be Heinrich Racker, who said the same thing in different ways. He said, that it's a myth in psychoanalysis that psychoanalysis is a process carried out between a sick person and a healthy one. He said it in more detail than that, but most of you probably know that quotation. And we could go through Winnicott and find statements that would serve almost as well as those, and other figures as well. Is there something we can say that would make everybody feel that way? Probably not, because they did it, and it didn't.
I would add Ferenczi to the list, with his
Ferenczi.
experiments with mutual analysis, where he would analyze the patient and then the patient would analyze him, as an experiment in trying to find, to level the playing field between the two. But of course, he did end up concluding that it wasn't exactly a level playing field, that there is some difference between the two, but there's more similarities than people give credit for.
Absolutely, but he overdid it. That's for sure. Even though he was one of the most creative people we've ever had in the field. But no, I think that's right, Jack. Your point about, let me see, I've lost the train of thought that I was developing there.
Equality in the relationship. We're all more simply human than otherwise. Yes.
Yeah. So Ferenczi really, when he said that that the two were not, when the playing field was not entirely level, I would thoroughly agree with that statement too. I didn't mean by saying that to say that the analyst and the patient don't play different roles. They do. They absolutely do. And I would not, there's no way around that. What I meant about level playing field is that we are both involved with one another, that is the therapist and the patient, in the same human way. The transference and countertransference, I don't use those terms so much anymore. I prefer the field, but transference and countertransference are ubiquitous. I mean, we are all unconsciously involved with our patients, and just the way our patients are involved with us, we have a different kind of responsibility for what we do with that involvement, and how we bring it to bear on the treatment. So it's a level playing field in the general human sense, but not in the professional sense.
Got it. Susan, do you feel like your issue was taken up?
I mean, yeah.
Okay.
It's just, there are many different strands we could follow to understand this. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I agree with you.
So there's a question from Daigu, forgive my pronunciation, Daigu Komer. Do you want to show yourself and ask your question? Tell us where you're from.
Sorry, I can't really open my camera because I'm at work.
Okay. Could you introduce yourself and tell us where you are?
Sure. I'm in London and I'm a trainee psychodynamic psychotherapist. I'm in my second year now. I mean, I recently started my second year, but I wanted to ask about what Donnel said earlier about making a useful interpretation, like clinically useful. And as a trainee, I was wondering, how can I sense or know what I'm going to say would be useful to the dynamic or the relationship or for the session? Thank you.
Well, that's a very big question. And I'm not sure that the answer I can give to it will be satisfying to you, but I'll try. I think that one of the things that your question brings up, one of many things it brings up, is the question of the willingness or not of analysts to use their own experience directly with patients. That is, self-revelation, if you will. Under what circumstances is an interpretation useful includes the question, is it ever useful to use your own experience that way? What I would say in response is that whenever I'm asking, to me, it's always a possibility to use my own experience, a possibility. It's never something that we ought to do. It's one of the alternatives. If I feel called upon to do it, to do that, or to say anything else that to the patient, I'm asking myself first, usually implicitly. I don't specifically sit there and ask myself this, but implicitly, I'm trying to let my experience snag on any possibility that what I am proposing to say to somebody it serves my narcissistic purposes more than I wish it did, and is not necessarily as devoted to the aims of the patient and the treatment as I wish it were. That's the best I can do. Really, I can make the judgment that what I think, what I want to say or do is a contribution, or is certainly intended to be a contribution to the unfolding of the treatment. But I do that with the knowledge that I'm fallible, and there are going to be times when I'm not going to be able to answer that question as fully and as in a way that I'm going to be able to be proud about in retrospect. There are times that I will feel that maybe it would have been better if I had done something else. It's always a question, though, about whether I think that my what I want to say serves the patient's interests. Now, the reason that I apologized, in a sense, for answering the question this way before I did it is that in having said this, I really haven't touched your question at all. Because your question is, how do I know when what I'm going to say or what I want to say is productive? That has to do with many things. I mean, one of the answers to that question has to do with the theory, your understanding of what's good about human life. All theory, it seems to me, is value laden. All theory has to do with a statement of what matters in living and what's important to be. Any notion of what constitutes psychopathology, for example, is really a question about what's good about living and what makes life valuable and what gets in its way. So all you can do is choose a theory, or let it choose you, since it often works that way, I think. Allow yourself to become involved with a theory that feels like it is an expression of the way that what's important to you in life, close enough that you can embrace it, and then do your best to employ it and maybe even add to it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Arlene Heyman, would you like to unmute yourself, introduce yourself, tell us where you are?
Yes, I'm a psychoanalyst, a psychiatrist. I'm in New York City, on the Upper West Side, if we're going to be.
I know your name for many years, but I don't think we've ever met.
That's true. This is the first time I've seen you. I've also known your name as well. And I read your paper last night, and I want to say something and ask something. One thing that I want to say is that it's important that we know things. An analyst has to go through training. You have to have some idea about development, So if a patient describes, as just happened to me before I got on this, that every night at dinner, her father was throwing the dishes and the food all over, and the mother was egging him on, and it was murder in the house, you have to know that's not expectable behavior, that no one is seeing these children, that they're not seen at all. And you can hook that up with the current experience the patient is having, that she's having friends over and she's completely tormented by, is the house clean enough? Has she bought enough food? Has she picked out the right restaurant? Nothing. She just won't be seen, and she has to make herself acceptable in some way. The only attention she ever got was criticism from both parents. So one has to have some idea of what a normal environment is. And
Sure.
these are things we learn. What do you go through as a child? What do you go through in adolescence? If you can't go through any of that because you're worried they're killing each other in the household. So there's a lot of intellectual material that one does have to master. So I don't think you intend, and I don't think we want to minimize that.
Absolutely not.
So that's kind of the basis. That's why we go through a lot of the training, is to understand what normal human experience is and what the different varieties of problems are. And we find out with each new patient something that we never imagined before. About what goes on between the patient and the therapist, are we asking here, are you asking a question of what makes for change in a patient? What makes a patient able to feel better, which is why he or she comes, because usually their life is bogged down in some way and they're miserable and they want help. So what is it that makes the patient feel better? And the question is, what we remember ourselves from our own analyses, and I've had several of them, is one thing of interest, what one remembers after an analysis is over. What one remembers as a therapist doing analysis, what you think is important to a patient, how much does what you think matter to the patient? What does the patient get out of it? So I would raise them as questions for you. I want to say that your dream and the analyst's response to it was very riveting, probably the most interesting part of the session so far as I'm concerned, because it was something real and concrete that happened and that moved you. He obviously gave you hope, and you were looking for hope, and he understood that, and he also thought you had good reason for hope, that he had a sense of you as a person and felt you would pull together and be able to move forward. And so he was with you, and that meant a lot to you. Now, what I'm asking about is, I could tell different things I remember from analyses, and they're very different from what you're saying. What is it that makes for change, and how do we see it differently as a therapist, and how do we remember it as a patient? I don't want to go on too long. I want to give you a chance to speak. Otherwise, I give you examples from
Yeah,
my own experience.
I can answer your question, Arlene, from my point of view. I mean, of course, you're asking a profound question, or a couple of profound questions, and I can only answer them from where I come from, but I'll be happy to try to do that. The way I understand the value of treatment to my patients, the value of my own treatment to me, has to do with a progressive melting of frozen places in the field. Places in the, you see, one thing I haven't really had a chance to say, because listen, I've been doing this for a long, long time, and we've just had a few minutes. One thing I haven't had a chance to say is that I did make reference to the idea that it is the interpersonal field that is responsible for the nature of the field, is what's responsible for what people can be aware of in one another's presence. Basically, a better way of saying that would be who they can be in one another's presence. We cannot be the same person in, with person X as we are with person Y. But there are all kinds of ways in which the field is, in unsuspected ways, blocked from being spontaneous, from being from unfolding in a way that is there's a word I want here, that's unimpeded by ways that we are, the two of us, locked into what Ben Wolstein used to call the transference countertransference interlock. He was very early in 1959, he referred to that the transference and the countertransference lock each other in to a particular kind of interpersonal field that's different for each patient and analyst. So I think that what makes a difference in treatment are all the ways in which I can witness my patient, but especially the ways in which that I can witness my patient that I could not witness my patient before. And the opening up of these new sources of spontaneity has to do with work with enactments between me and the patient that are the expression of those frozen places in the field, ways in which the field is stereotyped and structured in a way that doesn't allow me to even know what it is that I don't know. I once wrote a paper with the title of suggesting that psychoanalysis was that you, how did I put it? It's how do you psychoanalysis is what you do when you must search for something you don't know how to look for. That's not quite right. It was more clever wording than that, but that's the idea. Yeah.
I was just, like, it's interesting because Arlene's comment is really, you're at the large question, which everybody's been debating for a long time. What is the nature of therapeutic action? What is it that makes people better in treatment? And I thought what you said is, your position is the concept of witnessing it. It's not simply that you said something that was correct from the patient that provided them with some insight and they said, yes, that makes sense. But the fact of the relational aspect of the interpretation, it's that it's not just the words, it's the source of the words, and the awareness that there's another person there, unlike perhaps my parents, or other caretakers who, which is why I kept thinking about therapeutic, corrective emotional experience, in the reading of the paper, that I'm having a different kind of relationship with my analyst than I've ever had with anybody else.
Yeah. The clinical material in that paper, the one that you read, is intended to illustrate an idea that actually comes before witnessing. And you said witnessing is my idea of therapeutic action. You're quite right. That's certainly not an untrue thing to say. But there is one thing that even precedes that, and that is opening up the possibilities for witnessing that you don't even know are obstructed. And it is that working with enactments so that what has been not me feels like me, for the analyst as well as for the patient. That allows the dispersion of witnessing, or the application of witnessing to parts of the patient's experience and the analysts, which have not been available to it before. And it is working out those enactments that is as close as I can come to what really makes a difference. Once those enactments are, those frozen places in the field, I call them, are melted. Once that happens, well, then witnessing takes place in a way that's rather spontaneous, and it does have a therapeutic impact, absolutely. But it's making it possible for such a thing to happen that is perhaps the hardest part of the process. That it happens by itself once the melting has taken place.
Arlene, do you feel like you had the response you were looking for, or anything?
I think I understand something that's clearer to me about enactments. In the example you gave in the paper, you had blundered. You had, in the previous session, cut a guy off in the middle of a sentence to end the session, no? And out of that, and his being able to respond to that, you got to something about his childhood, and he was able to feel anger because you were able to work with the mistake and recognize it that you'd made. And I think that the spontaneity, the enactments you're looking for, I'm thinking of myself in one particular session where I had a phone call, and it was from my son, and I knew it was a very important phone call. It had to do with where he was matching in his residency, where he was going for residency. And I knew I was going to take that phone call. So I excused myself. I left the room, and I got the terrible news from my son that he was going to Chicago, okay? And I said I had to get off. I had a patient in here. And I came back in and sat down, and I was just coming apart. And my phone was ringing because I imagined my son had called his brother, and everything was going on. The patient continued exactly where she had left off before I left the room. And she just continued. It is the patient whom I saw just before this session we're having now. It's the same patient, okay? And she was just going on, and I'm sitting there thinking, should I end the session? Am I too distressed to be able to have a session? And slowly it came into me, what is this woman doing? How is she reacting to me and the phone's going and my leaving the room to take, which I've never, rarely have I done. If a medical thing comes up, sometimes. So finally, I was able to say to her, do you think anything's happened in me or with me, or what do you think? And she said, yes, she had the sense that I was really upset. And I said, well, why do you not say anything about that? You just keep going on. And what she said was that she didn't feel she had any importance, that I might get angry at her if she asked me, was I distressed? Because that wasn't her place. She had to keep her place, which was invisible as the patient. So that was an instance in which I felt very gratified that I had gotten something very important about this woman, and she had gotten something, and it was out of a mess. It would not be something you would ordinarily do. Leave the room, think you've got to end the session. And I think what you're saying is, from our own mistakes, from something that comes out of us at times, and our ability to handle that, not in a snotty way, but to be there, recognizing you've done something awry, that real things come out and you're in closer touch with the patient. Does that make sense? Am I close to what you're talking about?
Sure, but I wouldn't want to limit it to making mistakes. But of course, what you're saying is true. And in your example and mine do have that in common. I don't even know that. I think it's important that I never actually consider the things that my participations as mistakes, but as meaningful participations that, if I can, I'd like to put some legs to, get some kind of sense about what in the world, what was up with me anyway. And in this example, I didn't actually go back and ask, well, how come I did that?
Yeah.
Because I didn't get into that. But I certainly thought about it. I think though that what we don't know, while it's often reflected in what you were describing as a mistake, it isn't necessarily. It can just be something that goes by without being noticed, and later on, in some kind of way, for some reason, it comes to mind. You're able to see it. But yes, I think that that therapeutic action for me has to do with reducing the emotional distance between me and the patient in whatever ways I can do it without without an untoward reaction. Something that makes the relationship. You can say it in different ways. You can say something that makes the material unfold without more spontaneously. You can say it whatever it is that makes it possible for us to be in one another's presence in a way that's more thoroughly comfortable and accepting than it was a little bit earlier. It's not a.
I think that's a great closing thought.
Oh,
What
okay.
you just because we're just about to see we're enacting closing sessions right now. So, but that was a great closing thought. What you think therapeutic action from, and I really found the paper. I neglected to tell the audience when we started that you were one of my teachers, of course, and in some ways your elective was very influential in my thinking, in my last year of training. So that's also to your credit. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming. Mariana, we have some closing slides for everybody here. So there's an IPA webinar I guess in 2 weeks on psychoanalytic reflections on aging. And the next slide is we have our next journal clubs. The next one will be in March with Salman Akhtar, and then in April with Deborah Cabanis and the Psychoanalytic Formulation Collection. And finally, on June 13th, we definitely have Diana Diamond and Frank Yeomans coming. We might even have Otto Kernberg, who's one of the co-authors of their book, Treating Pathological Narcissism with Transference-Focused Psychotherapy. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Don, for your participation, and a little bit of applause to Don for his work today.
Thank you all for being here very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.